I've never called for in my own work and in my work in government to say, oh, let's just go back to the old days. Let's just, put everyone back in one big box and that's where we should go. Economic history doesn't work that way. So we have to understand there are reasons that there has been this change in structure, but we still have to think about, well, then how do we ensure working people against the downside risks that happen in a labor market? What do we do about unemployment insurance? What do we do about things like worker compensation? One of the impacts of the fissured workplace is that a lot of people, sometimes on a misclassified basis, sometimes on a legitimate basis, are called independent contractors. Well, what do we do to protect those people? Take the issue that is, very widely discussed right now is sexual harassment. If you are an independent contractor, technically, no one's your employer, which means you fall outside of the protections we have about sexual harassment. Well, that's clearly a big hole in our policies. My name is David Weil. I am the Dean of the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University and also a professor there. I am a INET grantee, and I'm the former administrator of the Wage and Hour Division of the Department of Labor under President Obama. So the concept of a fissured workplace is a way of describing what has happened to businesses in our economy and in many economies around the world, where on one hand, businesses become very focused on what is often called in business school speak core competencies, the things that reward investors and that customers value. At the same time that many companies were doing that, they also started to say, well, what don't we have to do? What can we shed? So along with this kind of increasing focus on core competencies, you had restructuring of businesses to shed activities to other enterprises. And with those activities came shedding employment and the workforce. And those things together are kind of in tension. If you really care about your core competency, but you're having someone else do the work, if that other entity kind of does things that muck up your core competency, that can get you in trouble. So the third thing about the fissured workplace is that business organizations figured out ways to make sure those other entities followed the rules, followed performance, quality outcomes, time outcomes, and certainly pricing outcomes, so that they continue to achieve core competencies, but let someone else handle what is this messy employment relationship. And the reason I use the idea of a kind of an odd word to describe it is that what I just talked about certainly has outsourcing and contracting out and things like that as a part of it, but it's this larger reorganization of businesses itself that is the central idea and the central thing we've seen happen in industries across the economy that has a whole range of effects on the lives of working people who might be operating under these very rigid guidelines, these very explicit standards, still emanating from these lead businesses, but carried out by maybe working as a subcontractor or working as an independent contractor altogether, working in a franchise system. It's that transformation that does fundamental things to the work relationship and to a lot of other outcomes in the economy. So the real question raised by the fissured workplace is, at one level, businesses are finding ways to have these other entities, other organizations, a subcontractor or a staffing agency, do precisely what they want them to do in order to deliver their service or their product. But because they're no longer their employees, you get kind of a pass. You kind of have it both ways. You get the outcomes, but you are no longer responsible for things like labor standards or for the provision of benefits or for making sure that people are living up to standards on discrimination or sexual harassment. All that is shed. To the extent that very often it's shed to other organizations that might be in more competitive situations or that might face the risk of, if that lead business no longer thinks you're doing a good job, you're done, and they will go find someone else to do it or maybe at a lower price. All of that means the people actually doing the work can be under much greater pressure or face working conditions that are far less beneficial than had they been the direct employee of those entities. And we see a lot of evidence of this. I got interested in this whole phenomenon because I was looking at who complies with basic labor standards. And one of the things I kept finding was that compliance problems particularly occurred in subcontracting system or among the franchisees of large franchisor systems, things like that. So one real problem is just these basic provision or keeping to labor standards, the violation of certain kinds of workplace policies, or the likelihood that you're going to be getting someone contributing to your health insurance or to your long-term pension. All of those things can potentially be lost by this reorganization. More recently, and it's certainly part of what I'm studying with INET, is it changes the way wages are set. There is growing literature and growing public policy discussion about increasing earnings inequality in our society. The trend towards greater earnings inequality has really happened alongside with this changing in how businesses are wired. I would make the connection, and there are a lot of papers coming out right now that really I think are consistent with this view, is historically, if you were a big business and you employed lots of people and everyone was sort of in the walls of your business, a classic case would be a company like Kodak. Whether someone was working in a production facility or might be an engineer, might be someone in new product development, everyone is in the walls, in the room. And so if I raise someone's wages in one part of the company, I have to raise the wages of everyone who is part of this entity. And there was an old literature in economics that looked at this. It was called the large firm wage premium. It's like economists always want to explain things by supply and demand. Why do bigger firms pay basically a 10% premium just because you're in a big firm? We would find that, and economists would pull their hair out trying to say, oh, no, it's differential, it's sorting, it's human capital stories. No one could explain it. It was a result that was persistent in the data. Over the last 20 years, that large firm wage premium has disappeared. The best estimates right now, it's about 3%, going from something in 10 to 12%. And that, to me, is another expression of the impact of the fissured workplace, that when you're no longer a direct employee of mine, if I am essentially paying you by setting a price to some other company rather than paying you a salary or a wage for that work, that means I can really treat you in a more hands-off market relationship. And that shows up in the wages of people still doing the work of that company, but no longer the direct employee of that company. That shows up in wages as well. If you're lucky enough to be in the Amazons and the Apples and the Googles of the world and a direct employee, you're doing pretty well. But if you are a contract worker to those companies, you're in a different box, and that box isn't doing so well. And so we're seeing a separation of people who essentially are getting higher earnings because they're on these businesses that are moving upward, and people whose wages are stagnating because they're being left behind in these kinds of different forms of fissured employment structures. That, to me, is one of the biggest challenges we face right now. The whole way we think about our workplace laws, the whole way we think about inequality, the whole way we think about training, kind of assumes an old way of firms being wired. And to the extent that that's less and less true, that means we have to look at those presumptions in fashioning future policies to deal with these issues. On one hand, I think we have to start by just saying we need to recognize these changes in our public policy discussions. We have to have everyone from people in Congress to people in government agencies to people who care about these policy outcomes in any organization to recognize the change itself. It's the context for thinking differently about what policies are going to work and which aren't. The other sort of whole sets of issues that are opened up by this is how do we define responsibility? How do we think about the fact that if an employer or a business might set up all kinds of conditions about what a supply chain is supposed to do for them or a franchisee is supposed to do, and yet we give them a pass on these other policies. That is permissible under many laws. When I was in the government, when I was at the Labor Department and in Wage and Hour, and some of my colleagues in other agencies did the same, we used existing laws to the extent we could to call the question in cases of what is often called joint employment, to say, not so quick. There are statutes as they exist that say you still have a responsibility as a joint employer. But there are limitations under the existing laws because they were written in a world where we thought differently about the basic employment relationship. We thought of the basic employment relationship like a rock. I mean, the reason I use the term fissured is the solid rock of employment that we assumed breaks apart, has fissured, and fissures deepen and fissures spread, and that's what we're seeing. So we have to, in that sense, not only try to make sure we're enforcing existing laws to the extent we can to make sure people take the responsibility where there is joint employment, but I think we have to revisit certain laws and ask basic questions about, do these even fit anymore? Should there be, for instance, some baseline set of standards that if you are getting the benefits of the work of people, that you have skin in that game and you have to think about how will that be protected. I think we haven't had that discussion as we need to. And then think about places where people really do have a different relationship. But the assessment of responsibility is a second area I would talk about. The third area that, again, our social policies just aren't set up to deal with is what do we do with the reality where this kind of change is going to persist? So we have to think about how do we ensure for these kinds of risks in a world where people are going to be operating in a lot of different places. And I think we have to think very differently about the problems of how do we give people opportunities to move up in the course of their work life. There is the old story of someone who comes into the mailroom and works their way up of a large business. And in the old structure of a lot of our industries, everyone didn't get to be the CEO. That was kind of an old canard that's not true. But on the other hand, people did get access to a social network. If we're living in a world where the mailroom or the equivalent, the entry, the IT department, the logistics department is being done by a contractor, then you're no longer part of that system. And what do we do for those people? How do we make sure that they get linked into social networks that can help them acquire skills, get better jobs, find out about other opportunities? All the things that I think used to happen inside larger businesses, those have broken apart, both in research that I've done and other folks have done. And in my government service, I heard really sometimes heartbreaking stories of people who were just dead-ended into contract jobs with staffing agencies or just sometimes with enterprises that gave them very little opportunity to move upward. I think our public policies have to think hard about how do we create new ways of giving particularly lower-skilled, low-wage workers who are very vulnerable, opportunities to improve their earning power for them and their households.